Hi, everyone. Fall 2022, English 3111, Brooklyn College, Medieval English Literature, talking about a late 15th century work called The Lady Prioress, about a nun who's pestered by three men who want to sleep with her, and she manages to trick them so they leave her alone. And in fact, she ends up with more money for her nunnery than she would have had otherwise. It's a very widely told story. Here's an illustration from one of them, from an Italian work from the 14th century by Giovanni Boccaccio, called the Decameron, which is 100 tales over 10 days. So on the ninth day of tale telling, on the first day, we hear about how Francesca di Lazzare tricks two annoying men by having them do various things with the corpse, and eventually they're frightened off by the town guard and leave her alone. So there are lots of versions of this. You can find them in a massive index of folklore stories put together first by a Finnish man named Arna, and then that index is translated into English by an American man named Stith Thompson, and then that's translated and expanded on into German by a man named Uter. And so under realistic tales, which is tales 850 through 999, we have the tales of fate. And in there, we have the tale that they call the Haughty Girl. And indeed, if we go down, we can find that this version of the story is called The Haughty Girl, where she entices three suitors who don't know each other into a churchyard, and then she manages to trick them, but then they take revenge on her by having her marry the hangman while she thinks he's the governor's son, so she's going to do well for herself. These are widely told in the Netherlands. There's three versions of them, but you can immediately see if you read the Middle English version that this is different from the Middle English version you read. So our version is not quite identical to this other version. It's closer, in fact, to some other tales where basically the woman comes out on top. She manages to trick the men, and she either ends up vindicated or indeed in an advantageous position. So an earlier version of this is from the 11th century Kashmir in present-day India by Somdevabhata, the Kati Seret Sagara. And you can click through on the PowerPoint if you'd like and read that. It's in the first volume, and it's a very nice story. It also is picked up and told in the Arabian Nights. It's told all over medieval Europe in a work that's called the Gesta Romanorum, the Deeds of the Romans. And there's a story about a carpenter, his wife, and this particular magic shirt, and the wife manages to use her carpenter's cabinets to lock away all the men who are trying to seduce her, and then reveals them all to her husband, and then he punishes them. It's also told in a French fabliau called Constant Duhamel, and there's an illustration from the manuscript, in fact, of one of those tellings of that. A fabliau is generally a French short verse story in which people engage in all kinds of basically sexual comedy. They tend to be extremely violent. There's a lot of castration jokes. And people love to tell these things in the Middle Ages. So this fits in with that because it involves stories of sexual humiliation. It's also told in the Middle English work called The Wright's Chaste Wife, in which a wheelmaker, his wife, is being pestered by three men who outrank her. They have got more money, and she manages to drop them down into a trapdoor and make them do manual labor, which they're not very good at, but they learn their lesson. So I think it's a really nice version to read if you want to compare to the Lady Prioress, especially if you want to write about it. So there's also a Dutch story about a folkloric kind of a demon trickster figure called De Lange Waper. And you can click through on that or read about it on Wikipedia and see there's another version of it. And that's where the woman doesn't really end up on top. So what I'm saying is that there are lots and lots and lots of versions of this. And we can take that and think, well, what makes this one special? So here we've got a picture. This is from the Louvre of a 14th century nun. So in this one, she doesn't have a husband to answer to. She's a prioress. So the only husband, in a sense, that she's answering to is God, because she's a nun. She's devoted herself to God. She's probably in charge of an abbey, or at least subordinate to an abbess who's in charge of an abbey. So she's a very high-ranking figure. That makes her the same social status as her suitors. So there's no sense of class conflict here. She is basically the equivalent rank to them. And the problem is, of course, that as a nun, she's supposed to be completely sexually pure. And that's the problem, is because she's beautiful and they want her. So this also is differentiated from the other versions because the three sex pests all are bringing different gifts. I don't think any of the other versions really do this. I think it's what makes this particular Middle English version superior to a lot of the other ones. So the knight brings venison, the priest brings a rosary, which are kind of prayer beads, and the merchant brings gold and other things that merchants bring. And then we see that the roles that they're forced to play when she tricks them, she has the knight pretend to be a corpse, and she has the priest pray over this corpse, and then she has the merchant dress up as a devil. And these are the sorts of things that I think are appropriate to a nun. They're almost like religious imagery, and they're designed to remind, I think, these lovers that they are mortal beings and that their bodies will die and that their souls are subject to the devil if they persist in this activity. So it's kind of a pedagogic trickery as well. And then the things that she makes them do, we find throughout medieval stories of romance, basically of knights fighting each other and falling in love with women and rescuing them from dragons and all the things you think of as kind of a key part of medieval literature. One of the things that women often do if they want a knight to show that he's really in love with them is that they make a demand on him that's seemingly kind of arbitrary or impossible. So in a work by in the 12th century by Chrétien de Troyes called the Chevalier de la Charrette, the Knight of the Cart, Guinevere, who's Arthur's wife, who's in love with Lancelot, says, well, if you really love me, you're going to do your worst while you're fighting in this great joust and this great kind of athletic competition. So go out there and humiliate yourself. And he does that. And the next day, after he does that, she allows him to do well the next day. And she also treats him very poorly because he hesitates before he jumps into a cart to rescue her, because that's, a knight in a cart just looks kind of goofy, and he doesn't want to be goofy. So she just torments him for the rest of this work because of that. So when she tells these three men to kind of do ridiculous things on her behalf, they're probably thinking, oh, this is good. That means the next day I'm going to be very successful. So let's just talk a bit about the Middle English. Now, this poem, as we'll talk about in class, is sort of a mess. Unfortunately, the manuscript has not been digitized. I'd have to go to England in order to see it, but it looks like, from what I've read, it's written in one hand by somebody who doesn't speak the same dialect as the original poem, so there's already some misunderstanding of the rhymes, and then someone else has gone in and corrected it over that, and you end up with this really sloppy, messed up manuscript. And Melissa Furrow, who edited this for Teams, has done really good work in kind of trying to reconstruct a version of this poem that makes sense, but it's still kind of messy. So I'm going to read this to you in Middle English and talk to you about some of the Middle English features. So I will do my best. The laddie that was Lobele, a lord's daughter she was, for poor and for precious, prove it in every place. Lordes and layman and spiritual, vergan chase. For her fair beauty, great temptation she has. Her love for to win, great gifts to her they brought. Many men loved her at the thought. She herself meat kept from shame she sought. She wist not who to begin. Okay, so here's her situation. So just to talk you through some of the Middle English. So the lady that was lovely, that was, should again be translated as who was, because the relative pronoun who doesn't yet exist in Middle English. So they use that instead of the relative pronoun who. Full is something you see very often in Middle English, and it just means very. It's an intensifier. You will often see the word right used in the same way, like right pure, right pure, very pure. You might see in some other texts in Middle English. Place, if you say it out loud, you might understand it just means place, proved in every place. Laymen, so lordes and laymen and spiritual. That means knights, spiritual people, clergymen, and laymen is everybody else. So this is basically one medieval sociological picture, that one of the very common ways that medieval people thought of their society was that it was divided into three groups: into the people who prayed, into the people who fought, and into the people who worked. So it's basically the people who worked is almost everybody, but this is the way that they tended to divide up their society. And so that's what's being described here. Everybody thinks she's attractive and wants to sleep with her. At least all the men do. Gan chase. So this just means chased. Gan is a form of the verb go, and it's being used as a past tense marker in this particular dialect, which is a dialect from Devon, or I believe Somerset, which are both places to the west of London, heading down towards Cornwall. For to, you can translate as in order to. And some things about the word order. Some great gifts to her they brought. think about the word order there. It just means they brought great gifts to her. So the to her is being kind of put there in the middle of that clause, or that second to last line is a little bit hard in terms of the word order. How she herself me kept from shame she sought, or rather, she sought how to keep herself from shame. So try playing around with de-scrambling the words until you find something that seems to make sense. There's a lot of freedom, especially in Middle English verse, and moving phrases around and words around to preserve the rhyme. So whist is that last thing I want to gloss. So that is a version of the verb witten, which means to know. The closest thing we have is the modern German wissen, which means to know, or the modern English noun wit, which comes from that same word. So she did not know how to begin. She wist not who to begin. She did not know how to begin. She didn't know how to protect herself. And once you read through this entire work, you will see the clever solutions she's come up with. So what's really interesting to me, and what I hope we can talk about on Wednesday, or maybe our presenter can talk about this if we have one, is two things. One is how this work elevates her into someone that we're supposed to care about. So if we look at aristocratic writing about seduction and love, especially in a 12th century work called The Art of Courtly Love, or The Art of Noble Love, by a man named Andrew the Chaplain. It's sort of a guidebook for seduction. He has all these rules for how noblemen should try to seduce noble women. But when it comes to a nobleman and a very poor woman, essentially he says, you can just take her. Her will doesn't matter. It's quite ugly, that little bit. It's an extremely ugly thing, and it sort of colors the entire work and kind of tells you in part what nobility means. And so for this to say, a lord's daughter she was, is to tell us this is somebody who should not be seduced, someone who's worth basically our care, is a person, right? And so this is a sentence that really makes sense in the context of a certain value of different kinds of women that I think is still carried forward, unfortunately and terribly, into the 21st century. The other thing I think is going to be very interesting for us to talk about from a feminist standpoint is this line, because of her fair beauty, she had great temptation, their love, her love to win. And you're like, this seems like a place where the manuscript is probably jumbled, and it's why I really wish I could see the manuscript. But it's suggesting that somehow she is in a way responsible for the temptation that these men are experiencing. And there is a way, I think, that sexism tends to blame women for what it is that men do. And maybe we can talk about that in more detail. But I think understanding this poem as a kind of reaction against that, in a way to have this woman save herself from, in fact, the kind of social coding that's happening right here in these lines, I think is maybe an interesting way to talk about this. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.